All right, so this is a PowerPoint on Toni Morrison, who is our author that will be studying the writer of Song of Solomon. This is Toni Morrison here. Her age, she's currently 84 years old. As you can see, she wasn't born Toni Morrison. And on the Fresh Air podcast, for those of you who will be listening to that, she explains how she became Toni. Morrison is her married name. She was a great fan of literature at a young age, and in fact, both her undergrad and master's degrees have to do with literature. So definitely a student of the canon, and mostly the Western canon. So you'll see some influence of the Western canon in her own writing. Additionally, as you can see here, her father was a storyteller in their family and shared many folk tales and stories about the Black community. And so that is also something that you'll see in her writing. Specifically to Song of Solomon, the idea of flight will be important, which you'll want to connect with Icarus. But she'll remind you, and we'll read some later work about how actually flying is a part of the African American storytelling. So more to come. She has had 2 children. One of her sons died a couple of years ago with pancreatic cancer, 2 boys. So yeah, some early influences. Morrison's father was definitely an influence, as I shared in the last slide. Controversially, she has been quoted as calling her father a racist, and I put a link here, excuse me, for you to learn more about this, because it's complicated, and the way she talks about it is complicated. But really, her father felt that people who were racist felt a sense of moral superiority that wasn't real, right? And that ultimately, those who are not racist have superiority over those who have that kind of false sense of superiority. I know it sounds a little complicated, but I hope you'll click on this interview and hear her talk about this more, because race is and ideas of race and construction are central to her text, right? So having a sense for how she feels about that as a writer will inform any interpretations you might make about her purpose. So hometown, she grew up in a fairly small town in Ohio, excuse me. She, as you can see here, she said that class was a bigger divider than race, and that she went to school with a variety of students. And it was only later in high school that she started to notice race more so. And then when she went to Howard, which is a historically Black university, and how race, and specifically skin color, and the preference that's given to lighter skin students there, because she became more aware of that. And you'll hear her talk about that in the Fresh Air link or podcast, which is what I'm going to ask all of you who are HL to watch, but SL students, I hope you might listen to it as well. So this is her background. She did go to Howard in 1953. Again, Howard is a historically Black, very prestigious university. And then she went on to Cornell, where she got a master's degree in literature. And she's been a professor of literature on and off for much of her life. Although after her divorce, she had to, because professors don't make enough. No, I don't think it's that. She went to work as an editor with Random House. And as you can see, there's a quick note. She played an important role in bringing Black literature into the mainstream, which is true. You can look at many of the artists, Toni Cade Bambara. There's several Black writers that she really championed as an editor and brought their work to bear. So she's been very influential, both as an editor, as a writer, and I imagine as a teacher. She's taught, most recently, she had a chair at Princeton, and just retired from Princeton in 2016. She is still writing. As you'll see, she put out a book as late as 2015. But she talks about she is now officially retired, even though she continues to write. So I want to just read this first quote to you from Toni Morrison, because I think it's so central to the way I want you to approach this reading. I think long and carefully about what my novels ought to do. They should clarify the roles that have become obscure. They ought to identify those things in the past that are useful and those that are not. And they ought to give nourishment. So coming to read Toni Morrison is not a put your feet up and sit on the beach. She's expecting her readers to be active and engaged. She's not going to introduce characters to you and say, okay, here's Milkman, for example, and here's everything you need to know about him. You'll be reading along and then you'll realize, wow, okay, this important character just came into view and into the novel. And she says she writes much like the way you experience the world, right? Like someone doesn't come up to you and shake hands with you and say, I'm going to be really important in your life, or an event doesn't come to you and happen and say, oh, that was one of the most influential experiences. And she approaches her novels that way too in her writing. So you will need to go back at times, because you'll say, oh, wait, I think that person was important, or I need to kind of check myself here. And that's normal with Morrison. She requires that kind of concentration, intelligence, which you're all very capable of, and imagination. So here's a couple of things about what she said about her craft. She says when she writes, the characters are so real to her that she's sometimes tempted to withdraw. She also, you'll see, it's not, and we haven't really talked about magic realism, which was a movement in Latin American writers where almost things that are fantasy become real. It's not quite to that extent. She's not a magical realism per se, but the ideas of dreams and folk and story come into her stories, and you'll definitely see that in Song of Solomon. When with this concept of flight, which becomes really important and central to the story. So these are Toni Morrison's major works. The one we're going to concentrate on is here, Song of Solomon, which was written in 1977, in a very important year. Wonderful, brilliant, smart human beings were born in that year. But as you can see, these are her novels. She also has written many short stories and children's books as well, which several of which she co-authored with her son. So you can see she's written over 45 years of her life, although she didn't come to become a writer until her, I think, late 30s, early 40s, which is interesting. She was a teacher of literature before she was a writer. And so Bluest Eye, her first novel, she wrote when her children were young and she was raising them. And so she'd write it in very kind of short excerpts, and it took her 5 years to write that. And then Song of Solomon, again, she wrote 7 years later. So music is very important in Toni Morrison's work. She had a book called Jazz, but you will hear, and we will be talking about the way music works in Song of Solomon as well. So keep that in your mind. So history is really important to her, and the Song of Solomon is situated right after the Wright brothers. I think it's 4 years past the Wright brothers' flight. So it is it's a historical novel in that it's not set in the present. But Toni Morrison in general has written about various times in history, the civil rights movement. Beloved, which is perhaps her most famous novel, is set in the South during the time of slavery, and it's the story of Sathie, who is an escaped slave. I've read the novel. It's probably one of my favorites of her books. So this past in history really comes to bear. You will see the Song of Solomon is, all of the characters are African American. You are being immersed in a Black community, and so you'll hear Black dialect and English in this novel and in many of Toni Morrison's novels. So, just a little bit about what she's been awarded, and it is great for a writer, an American writer. I think some of the things to note here is she did win the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1993. And when you think about it, I mean, she's written so many novels since then. So, I mean, she was recognized as a writer when she'd kind of halfway through her career, when she had only had not a handful, but not as many novels as she has now, which is pretty impressive. First African American to win the prize, although there were Latin American writers honored before her, and one of eight or nine women to ever win the Nobel in Literature. So she's very prestigious in what she's won, National Book Awards. So you can see that she's a very well-known writer. The Pulitzer, she's won, which is a prize that's given every year for one text. So very well-known and very esteemed. So for HL students, but again, I really strongly invite you, the SL students as well. Here is a Fresh Air interview with her. It's from 2015 when her last book, God Bless the Child, came out. So I want you to listen to this podcast. There will be some specific reference to that novel. Again, I know we're not studying that, but I think just even hearing her talk about that novel and her writerly process will benefit you. In this podcast, she also talks about her family, the influence there, and the way names work, which is essential for you to understand as we begin Song of Solomon. So please take a look at this over the weekend, and when you return to class next week, we will begin with a discussion of Toni Morrison and what we anticipate and look forward to in reading her work, Song of Solomon.